month again.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And welcome to Knock Once for Yes. Welcome, lovely listeners. We're back. We've just about pulled ourselves together in time for the spooky season. Thank you once again for sticking with us, and I can't wait to share what we've got lined up for you today. The paranormal postcard this episode was originally only meant to be a mini-sode, but in typical coffee fashion, it accidentally turned into a bit of an epic essay and a haunted pub crawl. So Fitz, what have we got coming up on today's episode?
Well, today we have a whole new segment as we partially retire the paranormal radar. We have listener stories from Cody, Megan and Maddie, and we bring you not just one, but 4 haunted locations on this episode's paranormal postcard as we take you all on a journey to the world's end.
But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to take a moment to thank our latest patrons.
Sam Morris,
Lee Evans,
Susanna Holloway,
Julia Rose,
Katie P,
and EJ.
And we'd also like to thank Sammy, Stuwaha and Byron Magpie for making donations through Coffee.
As always, we want to say a heartfelt thank you to all of our supporters, old and new. It is solely your support that enables us to continue sharing ghost stories, haunted history, and paranormal community space that we love so much. We simply couldn't do it without you, and you guys are the heart and soul of this show. We are very probably behind with our mailings as usual, so apologies if anyone's waiting on anything. My brain is frequently like scrambled egg these days, and I keep finding that 3 months or so has passed without me even noticing. So we will get on that very soon, and I know for sure that we have a stack of postcards from the next location to write for our postcard level patrons. So we'll get on with warming up our handwriting muscles for that. You know, it's only when we write these postcards that I suddenly remember that I don't write anything else by hand anymore, and my hands are literally unfit from not practicing.
Same.
But enough about our lack of handwriting skills and executive functioning. For spooky season is already upon us, and it is time to get stuck into some ghostly goodies. Now, this is normally where we ask, what has pinged the paranormal radar? But today we have something a bit different. Today we do not have a paranormal radar, we're bringing you something else instead. You know how much we love seeing paranormal stories in the newspapers, mainly because they're trotted out often to fill a slow news day, and as a result, they can be quite tenuous and pretty amusing. But I honestly haven't even seen a spooky news story for months, and I think it's just because there haven't been any slow news days for about 3 years, probably. And you know, sometimes these days the news is something best avoided. So instead, I'm introducing Paranormal Bucket List. This idea came about because we just happened to be watching Nuke's Top 5 one Sunday with our weekend bacon butties, as is sacred Coffee HQ tradition. And if you don't know, Nuke's Top 5 is one of those compilation footage shows on YouTube where people send in their home videos in which they think they've captured possible paranormal activity. I mean, you have to take quite a lot of the footage with a pinch of salt, but it can be a fun watch. You occasionally get some corkers, and it's just a bit of a weekend indulgence for us. But on the last episode, they featured a place that we immediately decided would have to go on our bucket list of spooky places to visit one day. Now, that's something that we've said a lot over the years while we've been doing this show, so I thought it was high time that we started to dive into that list a bit and share some of the places we really want to visit one day with you guys. In fact, you might have a place to suggest for us, or maybe some of you who live closer can visit some of these places on our behalf and report back with your own experiences. So with all that said, I would like to introduce our new show segment, Paranormal Bucket List.
And today we're talking about a haunted pizza parlour. I know, probably not what you were expecting, right? But this is no ordinary pizza place, because Ozone Pizza Pub is housed in the basement of a huge, largely abandoned, late Gothic revival building built in 1915 that looks like a castle, but in fact used to be a Catholic hospital, once known as the Sacred Heart Hospital. The site hasn't been a medical facility since 1965, but after it was abandoned, instead of being left to ruin, the building was partially renovated and became home to a few small businesses on its lower levels. But the reason Ozone featured on Nuke's Top 5 was because an employee of the pizza parlour had captured some slightly alarming footage of the building. The old Sacred Heart has a spooky reputation and is said to be haunted by the ghosts of former patients and of the nuns who once nursed them. One night, a few employees decided to walk a circuit around the many-winged building after their shifts to see if they could spot any of the apparitions for themselves. It was 11:30 p.m, and the staff members were sure the building was empty. But in one of the upper windows, they could see the dark shape of a human figure standing in front of the glass. In the video, it sounds like the group are going back and forth on whether they could be mistaking some item or piece of furniture for a human shape. But then, someone points out that whatever it is has got arms. In their footage, it also looks like the figure starts to move past the window. So, could it possibly be the ghost of a nun or a former patient? Well, according to an article in Atlas Obscura, during the opening hours of 8 till 5, as well as eating at the restaurants, visitors can access some areas of the old hospital on the first 3 floors, where there are display cases filled with antique medical equipment and curios, as well as black and white photographs of the nuns from years ago working in the hospital. Could those old objects remaining in the building stir up the spirits of former patients and staff? Well, one thing's for sure. Outside of those opening hours, the first 3 floors are closed to the public, and the floors above that are derelict, without electricity, and in some places dangerously crumbling, so those areas are always off limits to everybody. So, if you do happen to be walking past the old Sacred Heart at night, and you see something moving in one of the upper windows, then there definitely shouldn't be any living souls up there.
Now, doesn't that sound like somewhere that needs to go on our bucket list? Although, if you're listening, Ozone, please get some gluten-free pizzas on the menu for me before we visit Florida, because otherwise I'm going to be very sad at not being able to try whatever a Ponderosa Stomp is, because it sounds amazing. Their menu does say, though, that they do a vegan cheese option, so that's pretty cool. And I checked the map, and it's just around the corner from a public supermarket, so I can go and buy all their gluten-free cookie dough and chocolate-covered pretzels, which I really miss from our time in Florida. And I also miss their wonderful coffee aisle. American coffee lovers, you guys just don't know how good you've got it. American supermarkets blew my mind with their double-sided coffee aisles that just run the entire length of the shop. Come to English supermarkets and you'll be seriously disappointed. We have like 3 coffee blends and some Nescafe Instant, and it's just not good enough. It's just not good enough, England.
Indeed, as coffee lovers, it is a great disappointment. So, we hope you all enjoy the new segment. Do let us know if you have any haunted places that you think need to go on our paranormal bucket list. And if you check out any of these places for yourselves, we want a full report, like spooky homework.
But now, grab yourself a pumpkin-spiced beverage, a blankie and a biscuit, and let's celebrate spooky season with some real listeners' ghost stories. And this first one is from Cody.
In my family home that I moved into around age 7, paranormal things rarely happened, except at the very beginning and end of my stay there. Just before going off to college, I was sleeping in my bedroom in the basement, when suddenly I was woken up by someone hitting my face with my decorative pillow. Expecting it to be my brother, I yelled at him. No response. No movement. I made my way to the other side of the room, feeling for the only lamp, but, turning it on, no one was there. I swore I must be dreaming and went back to bed. The next night, the same thing happened, only I knew I wasn't dreaming this time. Too scared to move right away, I froze in my bed. Then I heard my nail polishes moving around on their glass miniature table by the door, and on the other side of the room. It was a very distinct sound of glass on glass, the bottles just slowly moving around. I was absolutely soiling myself at this point. Suddenly, a coin from my coin jar, also by the door, came ping, flying across the room, hitting my nightstand. That gave me the motivation to run to the lamp, which was a touch lamp. But before I could touch it, it went on, off, on, off, on, off, with me standing just in front of it. I just sat there watching it do that for a few seconds, and then screamed bloody murder for my mother whilst running and falling up the stairs. I cried like a little kid and never went into that room alone again. I slept on the couch until I moved out a couple of months later. Sometime after, I found out a little boy had lived there and died in the 70s. Perhaps it was him playing. Perhaps it was something more nefarious. I'll never know. My mum moved the family to another home while I was away at college, although not because of the ghosts.
Thank you so much to Cody for sharing your experience with us, and bonus points for use of the word nefarious. I love that word. I try and use it wherever possible. It does sound, though, more to me like a playful spirit. Now, that's not to say that it wasn't terrifying in the moment. I would have been terrified faced with all that going on. It sounds terribly scary, but it does sound a little bit like a playful child spirit.
I'm not sure about playful. That to me sounds like I'm desperately trying to get your attention.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's like, wake up. And then when you go to the lamp, it's like, here, pay attention to me.
Yeah, but I forget sometimes that Fitz didn't grow up with brothers and sisters. I did. See, it sounds playful to me because that is absolutely what a kid does. You know, when you're asleep and I have a younger brother, obviously I remember both of us interacting with my parents in this way. And we'd wake up early in the morning and they'd be trying to have a lay-in, bless them, and we'd be basically peeling their eyelids open and like jumping up and down and going, wake up, wake up. So to me, that does sound kind of just like a kid.
Oh, my only child is showing here. If I woke up not that I tended to wake up early, but if I woke up early on a weekend, my first thought would not be, I'm going to terrorise my parents. It would be, I'm going to read that book I was looking forward to reading.
Oh, my goodness, your parents were very lucky. They perhaps didn't appreciate how lucky they were.
Maybe. But I think, as well as that, I think because of the incidences we tend to have here, where interactions are often like a warning or something is going to happen, something important's coming.
Yeah, not a warning in like a foreboding sense almost, more just...
Although the fire with McKee ring was a good one.
Yeah, we have had warnings that have been quite urgent where we've had activity in the house and it's been trying to obviously alert us to something that could be a danger. But often it's just a case of, just be alert, like be on the alert, something's going to happen. And often that's just in the wider world rather than something that's a direct threat to us. But it's not ever been a sinister thing, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, so I'm curious whether we take your example and whether it was like, let's have some fun, or whether it was like potentially more mine. It's like, I need to tell you something or share something.
Or sometimes in those cases when a spirit seems to be trying to get somebody's attention, it's just literally that they want to be recognised.
Yeah, true.
It's just they're trying to say, I'm here, please acknowledge me.
Although if it was me, I'd have still said, I'm curious, put a carbon monoxide and a radon detector down there just in case they're trying to warn you about something like that.
Yeah, but that's very, very skeptical. Not skeptical of you, very practical of you.
Well, I haven't worn my skeptic practical hat in a little while, I thought I'd better get. We've had a reshuffle, so I should get it out, put it on occasionally.
Give it a bit of an airing.
Yes.
Fair enough. Well, thank you so much, Cody. It was a really interesting experience.
Well, it's time now for our next listener story, and this one is from Megan.
I grew up in Milford, a coastal city in Connecticut, in a small 3-bedroom bungalow. We moved in when I was about 4 years old, and I lived in this house until I was 19. The house was built as a 2-bedroom sometime in the 1960s and was originally served as low-income housing, but then was later somewhat awkwardly remodelled to add a master bedroom at the back of the house. When we moved in, my brothers and I took the upstairs rooms, and my mum took the master bedroom. The house was always a bit strange. It was small and awkward to manoeuvre around due to haphazard repairs and renovations over time. Throughout the years, many of us had unusual occurrences in the home. Cabinets left open in the morning we swore we closed. The uncomfortable sound of shuffling dining furniture in the night. Small sights out of the corner of your eye. The occasional touch or stuck door no one could explain. I had a friend stay the night, and she said she felt a presence sit at the foot of her bed, so much so that she could see the indent. She never came back to my house after that. Growing up in Connecticut, though, everything is haunted. If you did not personally have a story, you knew someone who did. The history of my town was rich and complex, having first been established in the 1800s. So needless to say, it wasn't mean, it wasn't throwing things at us, so we frankly paid it no mind. Then, things began to change. When I was 17, my brothers had moved out, and my mum decided to leave Connecticut. The plan was for me to move in with my dad and his girlfriend until I graduated high school. After some unsuccessful house hunting, my parents had a plan. My mum and her boyfriend would move out of the house we were in, and my dad and his girlfriend would move in. This way, I would experience the least disruption possible through what was already a stressful period of my life. With this house swap, I was also given the master bedroom on the bottom floor. I should have been excited by this. A teenage girl being upgraded to the adult bedroom, more space, a bigger closet, a view of the backyard, my own entrance. However, it just never felt right in that room. My insomnia began to pick up, and my overall mood became much darker. Sure, you could chalk this up to hormones and some difficult life changes, but as I reflect on this period, a stable and happy adult, I don't just think it was teen angst. My dad and his girlfriend wasted no time in making the new house their own. Old furniture out, new furniture in. Reconfiguration of rooms, additions of antiques, crystals, tools of divination, and other quirky items they'd collected over time. The whole house felt completely different within days, and I suspect our Casper was not a fan of all this upheaval in their space. The first incident my dad's girlfriend experienced was in the upstairs bedroom, in the same room where my friend had had her ghostly encounter. She was unloading some boxes and had just set up a small lamp on a desk, plugged it in, and then went to the other room to grab some more items. When she returned to the room, the lamp was unplugged and on the floor across the room as if it had been thrown. Now, this would probably yield most people to run from the house and not come back. Instead, she thought it was a thrill. She shouted, "Cool! Thanks for showing you're here. We mean you no harm, and I'm going to put the lamp back now." That wouldn't be the first item to be moved in an aggressive manner. Additionally, all the activity that used to be somewhat benign picked up quite a bit. More open cabinets, cold spots, items moved to strange places, Most distinctly, I began hearing running up and down the stairs off my bedroom almost every night. When I would check, no one would be there. My dad, while a believer in the paranormal, shrugged off many of these incidents. It was an old house, there was a lot going on, we're just forgetting where we're leaving things, all different ways to rationalise the activity, until one day. I was at school and my dad was sitting in the living room on his computer when he heard a radio blaring from my room. He thought to himself, I must have set an alarm I'd forgotten about. He went over to my room, put his hand on the doorknob, and the music stopped. Odd, but he didn't think much of it and went back to the dining table. As soon as he sat down, the music began again. This pattern of music playing, Dad goes to door, music stops, continued on for about an hour. At one point, my dad entered the room and just waited, inspected all the radios, and left, and the music began once again as soon as he sat down. When I returned from school that day, he asked me, "Hey doll, why would a radio go on and off from your room when you're not there?" I replied, "Because this house is haunted and you won't believe me." We both entered my bedroom to investigate. I turned my alarm clock on, which I intentionally set between stations so that the blaring static would be sure to wake me. "No, that wasn't it. It was definitely music," he said. We turned on the TV, thinking maybe I had it on a music TV station. It was not, and it was set to a station that would not have music consistently in the way my dad was hearing. I then turned my attention to a boombox that sat next to my TV, by the door where I consistently heard the running up and down the stairs. I turned it on and played the CD which was in the player. "That's it, that's the music I heard," shouted my dad. Now, the thing is, that boombox had no batteries. It also wasn't even plugged in. I had to do that to get it to play. When I pointed that fact out to my father, he looked at me and said, "Okay, maybe this place is haunted." Activity continued to escalate from that point on. Maybe we'd made the fatal error of acknowledging it, but the activity went from playful to more threatening. I began having bouts of sleep paralysis, something I'd never experienced before, and I began seeing black shadows throughout my room at night. I would have nightmares of being held down and wake up with bruising on my ankles and arms. I woke up once to the sound of my bedside lamp hitting the floor across the room. This thing really did not like lamps. The scariest incident of all eventually led me to planning my exit from the home. After the lamp incident, I made my way to the local metaphysical store. I told the lovely Wiccan who ran the shop of my woes, and she loaded me up with sage and recommended a purchase of a smoky quartz crystal. She stated the crystal would help ward off negative energy. I figured anything would be worth trying at this point, so I bought the pendant and knotted the cord tightly around my neck. I never took the necklace off, not even to sleep or shower. A few days after, I began to feel better. Maybe it was psychosomatic, but I felt more at ease in the house. I even began hanging out in my room during the day again. One morning, I awoke and noticed that the necklace wasn't around my neck. Thinking that the cord had snapped, I began tearing the bed apart to find the necklace, with no luck. I then noticed on the bedside table that my necklace was laid out neatly next to the lamp. Thinking I must have removed it in my sleep, I went to slip it back on. The necklace would not fit over my head. it was still knotted. I inspected the necklace, seeing if maybe I had somehow unknotted and reknotted it in my sleep, but it was most certainly only knotted once, in the same spot I had tied it when I purchased it. I hightailed it out of there and stayed with a friend for a week. In my mind, I saw the incident as a threat. Oh, you think this little rock can help you? Think again. I ended up tearfully telling my dad what had happened. One night while I was away, he and his girlfriend lit sage and cleansed the house. My dad went room by room demanding whatever was in the house to get out and leave me be. Things did settle down after that. We still had the small bump in the night from here to there, but nowhere near as negative. Sometimes I wonder if the house was truly haunted, or if my own teenage angst, sadness, and energy caused some kind of poltergeist. After I moved out, my grandmother moved in and claimed to hear sounds of someone running up and down the outside stairs and furniture moving at night, though my dad and his girlfriend said they felt the activity stopped after I left.
And thank you to Megan for sharing that story with us. Now, I've used my skeptic hat. I've got to put it back in the cupboard now.
You put it back in the cupboard?
Because I wonder whether there's more than one thing going on there. You had the sort of base level activity, and your mum moved out, your dad moved in, they cleared the house out, which can,
shake
things up anyway. But the sort of things you were talking about them bringing in as well, and how the activity changed from just, oh, there's weird stuff going on, to actually this is quite sinister, makes me wonder whether they brought something in with them.
See, I didn't see it quite like that, because I think what you're saying, if I'm right, is that they may have brought in something haunted with them.
Mm-hmm.
But I was feeling more like, we see this in so many cases where a spirit that's already in a house doesn't like when somebody new moves in, and they don't like they're having all their stuff moved around.
Oh, yeah.
But also, on top of that, it could be that they don't like what they're moving in.
Mm-hmm.
So where Megan mentioned some of the metaphysical items they were bringing in, it could just be that if this spirit, as maybe somebody who used to live in the house, that they just took a particular dislike to those items, as we can see with living people all the time. And this wouldn't be the first case where we've heard of this happening before, where somebody's brought in a completely innocent deck of tarot cards and the activity's kicked off because whoever lived there before was just really averse to them for some reason. The other thing I think is perhaps going on here, Megan mentions that she wonders whether it was actually her that was creating the poltergeist activity. But I think, the activity seemed to be going on before all the upheaval happened. And it seemed to carry on afterwards when her grandmother came in. So I suspect what's happening here is more of, rather than her creating it, a layering effect. You've got some activity in the house to begin with. That's then got sort of kicked up by all the moving around and new people coming into the house and changing things up. You've got Megan herself having, going through a transitional period of her life, as we all do as teens. And you've just got energy layered on energy, and this kind of effect where it builds up into something bigger and seemingly more negative. And that sounds really scary, but in actual fact, I think we all kind of, well, it sounds a bit woo, but we all kind of experience this in our daily lives. You know what it's like when you go into work and you turn up and the first person who's gone in that morning has just come in a foul mood. They got up late, everything went wrong, they got stuck in traffic, they're just grumpy as all get out. And then the next person that comes in kind of picks up on that. And then things start going wrong because everybody's at each other's throats and just Maddie. And then the next person that comes in, they pick up on it as well. And by the end of the day,
you can feel it.
You can feel it, right?
Yeah, the old, you could cut the tension with a knife feeling. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And by the end of the day, everybody's having a terrible time. They're all biting each other's heads off, and you've got a really negative environment. And we see this personally all the time. And I feel like it's just the same thing. or at least very similar, but perhaps, a bit more complex. On a spiritual level, when you get situations like these, it just kind of builds up into something bigger, and it kind of starts to get out of hand a little bit, much like we again see with people's moods and flying off the handle with each other. So I really think your dad did the right thing by just putting his foot down and saying, no, this is not how it's not going to be like this. This is not okay. We need to he kind of burst the bubble like you can do with two squabbling children, when you just put your foot down and go, this is getting out of hand. This is not how it's going to be. We need everything to calm down now. And a lot of times, as it did in this case, that does the job.
Indeed. And I think there's just one more thing that stood out to me, or at least a different interpretation.
Yeah.
Was the necklace at the end when she mentioned that she felt it was quite threatening that it was taken off and put on the nightstand. Whereas I kind of interpreted that as more respectful. Like, it wasn't broken.
Yeah.
It was placed by the lamp. It kind of felt to me more, sorry, you don't need this anymore, rather than we don't like this. I expect it would have disappeared or been broken or something if that was the case.
That's really interesting, and I hadn't thought of that. But yeah, I like it. I like that different perspective. And again, we would never say to anybody, oh, you shouldn't have been scared in that situation. I'm sure I would have done exactly the same thing. Fled the house, would have been absolutely terrified. But yeah, to just kind of look at it after the fact, it does seem quite respectful, that laying out of it. Not, the string wasn't snapped, the crystal wasn't broken. Yeah, I can see it from that perspective, sure. So thank you once again to Megan for sharing those experiences with us. And we've just got time for one more story this episode. This one is from Maddie, who wrote my favourite and I think our best review that we have ever received, when she said, listening to you two chat is like sipping on a warm cup of tea, only the tea is filled with ghosts. I cannot even begin to describe to you, Maddie, how much I love that. I've got nothing left to prove. We have peaked. We've peaked. I couldn't possibly ask for a better review than that. But now, on to Maddie's story.
In my early teenage years, my best friend lived in a house that I can only describe as a portal or a black hole. At the time, her two older siblings had moved out, so it was just her mother, her father, and their family cat named Lily. Now, her parents could not be any more different. Her mother was quite the eccentric type, always with big curls in her hair and thick eyelashes. She would take us all over the valley we live in for food, shopping, and various other activities. On the other hand, my friend's father was a strict, silent type. He was not supportive of my friendship with my best friend, and often wore a scowl on his face. Being a businessman, he was not home very often. This left us three girls to a lot of mischief and fun, some of which was much more sinister than I realised at the time. To set a bit of background, the house they lived in was huge to my modest household anyway, and was jam-packed with stuff. My friend's mother was a hoarder, and a bad one. The only room that was untouched by the chaos was the front sitting room, which was decorated with vintage seating and porcelain figurines. The rest of the house was filled with clothing, toys, food, decor, and the like. It was so bad that my best friend's room was uninhabitable, and she would often spend the night in her older sister's room, which was also full but had an accessible bed. When I would spend the night, we would sleep in the basement. The layout had the stairs in the middle of the floor plan, with rooms circling around the staircase. Immediately to the left of the stairs was the entertainment room that had a massive television, which is where we would spend much of our time. Behind that room was the bathroom. Across the hall and behind the stairs was her older brother's room. and to the left of that room was a playroom, packed to the gills with toys, mostly dolls, and an air hockey table. With my friend's mother, we would often try to hold seances, and even use a Ouija board several times. I've heard deep male voices and seen things move. I even caught a voice on an audio tape I snuck from my dad, where a male voice said, "If you want to see a ghost, something, something, something." None of us could make out the 3 words at the end of the statement, but it left us all chilled. I have 3 specific instances I'd like to share with you that have stuck with me my entire life. One summer evening, a mutual friend of ours spent the night with me at my best friend's house. It was late at night, and the 3 of us were packed into a hide-a-bed. The 2 of them were asleep, but I was wide awake. I had just finished watching a movie and turned off the video player when, from the playroom, I heard what sounded like a doll faintly say, "Mama." The 2 of them shot up from their sleep, and we all looked towards the playroom. I whispered, "Did you hear that?" They both nodded. Too afraid to move, we stayed huddled up with each other until the sun started to rise. As soon as we could see well enough, we ran upstairs and begged her mother to look in the playroom with us to see if we could locate the source of the voice. All 4 of us scoured that room. We looked at every doll, toy, and electronic and found nothing that could have made that sound. The hoard has since been cleared out, and nothing was ever found to explain that to this day. On another summer day, my best friend's mother had taken us on a drive into the city, which was 30 miles away from her house. While on the road, my best friend received a call from her father on her cell phone. I can immediately tell her father was upset about something by the look on her face. She just kept repeating that she was not home, hadn't been home for several hours, and was currently in the car. After a bit of back and forth, she hung up and explained to me that her father said he had seen her walk up the stairs just now, and that she wasn't responding to him when he was asking her questions. I think her father dropped it as some sort of prank, as he had adamantly denied belief in the paranormal, but I'm certain he'd seen a doppelganger of his daughter. That night, we heard footsteps going up and down the stairs for hours, and no one was ever on them. The last story I want to share with you took place early morning on a school day. Now, her father may have attributed my best friend's naughty behaviour to my influence, but my best friend and her mother were the ultimate bad influences. This morning, my friend had expressed her desire to skip school that day and called her mother to come pick us up before classes started. Because it was early in the morning, her mother told me that since my friend's father was still home, I had to sneak in and hide in the basement until he left. I was uneasy with the thought of spending time alone down there, but since the sun was rising and provided light down there, I agreed. I sat on the floor with my back against the hide-a-bed couch. I was starting to nod off, but each time I nearly fell asleep, I felt a tickle on the back of my neck. I would startle and whip around, to nothing being there a few times, until I decided to sit on top of the couch instead. I was falling asleep again when I started to hear a shuffling sound like paper. I just dismissed it as my friend's cat Lily playing in the other room. However, I recalled the door at the top of the stairs and how Lily was not allowed in the basement. Still, I brushed it off and closed my eyes. But the rustling got louder and closer. It was just beyond the bend of the couch. I could feel my breath hitching and my heart pumping. I was much too scared to look, so I squeezed my legs in and made myself as small as I could. When suddenly my friend's mother called my name from the top of the stairs. Despite being terrified, I bolted up from the couch and clambered up the stairs. There were no papers and no cat behind the couch. In fact, upon reaching the main floor, I could clearly see Lily was napping peacefully on a couch in the front room. I've spent so much time in that house and have had several other unexplainable experiences, but these 3 have stuck with me the most as I've grown up. My friend is still a close and dear friend of mine, and though she no longer lives at home, her parents still live in that house. The hoard was entirely cleaned up, and the house looks almost unrecognisable, though I hear there are still voices and sounds occurring with no explanation of their source.
Thank you so much to Maddie for sharing those stories with us today.
And for the best review in the world.
Absolutely. We really, really mean that. It made us so happy. So the first thing I've got to address is the haunted doll or the creepy mama. I mean, it's been a while since we had a creepy doll story on the show, and how awful to not even be able to find where it was coming from.
Yeah, I was going to say there's nothing worse than a creepy doll, except for the creepy doll that you can't find.
I think that's one experience that we haven't actually had ourselves because we don't have toys around the house. We don't have kids. Although I did have, it was like a Halloween cup. And I don't know whether any of you guys have seen these. It had like a little voice box in it. It had a sensor in it so that when you picked up the cup, it cackled. Yeah. It like did this witch's cackle. And I don't think it was paranormal at all, but at some point the poor thing went a bit senile and it just started going off in the middle of the night in our bedroom.
Yep.
You'd just be laying there in the dark and then all of a sudden you'd hear this cackling from the corner of the room.
But didn't we have this problem where you couldn't seem to get it to work and yet it worked for me?
Yes. Yeah.
That was weird.
It was a bit spooky.
Although you have forgotten about the creepy doll we had.
Which creepy doll?
Do you remember we got a present?
Oh, yeah, but that didn't speak. It just looked creepy.
It was very creepy.
I honestly
and we disposed of it before it could murder us in our sleep.
Yeah, I could not have it in the house, but it didn't do anything.
It did stay in the house though, didn't it? Because we gave it to somebody else to live with us.
That's true, we did. Okay, I couldn't have it within my sight.
No, it was terrifying.
It really was.
Absolutely horrific.
But
yeah,
not haunted.
Before it murdered us in our sleep, we got rid of it, so we were safe.
Yeah. It's also been a while since we had a doppelganger story. And often what we've found in the past is that doppelganger stories sometimes sort of segue into Vardoga stories, which is something slightly different. That's where you see somebody living, doing something that they're literally about to do in real life and you kind of see what they're doing just before it happens. That didn't sound like a Vardoga case, though.
We have had a good Vardoga story that's going to be coming up in a future episode,
have we?
Which you're going to enjoy. Yeah.
Oh, I haven't read that yet. That's exciting.
Very good.
The other thing I wondered, I don't know. Sometimes we find in houses where there's a chaotic energy, it can make activity really ramp up. And I think that this is something we have experienced. I think that in the shared house we lived in, where we had an awful lot of activity, I think it was the amount of people in that house and the kind of chaotic energy that created that helped ramp it up, because it did get worse as that situation kind of intensified.
And I'm going to have to say liminal, because it was like
take a drink, everybody.
It was a transient house for people that are kind of displaced from other places. Not to say that it was like, a halfway house or anything like that. It was just, it was like a student home for adults.
Yeah, it was like a student home for people that weren't at university, but hadn't they were in between stages of their life. Yeah, and I think it is, unfortunately, it is liminal is the word. It was a transient space. And I think that chaotic energy really sort of ramped up the activity that was already there. And I wonder...
Something did, because the place was terrifying.
It was. But I wonder whether the hoarding of the mother in this story, you know, having that stuff everywhere, the items everywhere, made it a bit of a chaotic space. Because it can feel like that. I mean, I'm sure everybody knows how it feels when your house gets a bit out of hand and you just know, oh, I really need to get on top of the clutter. And the actual space starts feeling quite uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that little bit of sort of chaotic energy going on there. So I wondered whether maybe the hoarding element of it sort of tied into that haunting and kicked up the activity more, perhaps?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it doesn't seem to be entirely focused on that because you said it still carried on after the house was cleaned as well, but certainly could have done something to the sort of level of activity that was going on. I'm just intrigued to know whether her friend's father ever became convinced that something weird was going on. Because he was in all the stories, he was very skeptical, but if they're still there and things are still happening, and obviously, you know, the daughter is an adult now, I wonder if she went back and said, you know, you remember that time you blamed me for blah, 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 and I was out with mum?
Yeah.
Whether he would take it a bit more seriously now she's an adult.
Well, I don't know. I mean, some people, you forget sometimes that a lot of people that we have submit stories to the show, even though they've had that experience, they still absolutely don't believe in anything paranormal. And that's fine, you know, we have no problem with that at all. Some people just will always maintain that perspective and it will never change. Whereas other people, you know, like a story we had earlier, the perspective very much changes at a certain point, you know, that there's a tipping point.
Yeah, for those of you out there that are skeptics, like, I'm with you. Like, I will talk about ghosts and spirits and la-di-da-di-da, but, you know, that's not to say that I know what they are.
Or even that you necessarily...
that I'm certain of anything.
Yeah, or even that you necessarily believe that they're the spirits of dead people or, you know... We talk about so many things in almost under an umbrella term because it makes it easier to discuss. And we love discussing this stuff. It's fun. But
like, generally, at best, like, if you pushed me for what I was absolutely certain was true, then I would just have to say I am absolutely certain that was weird and interesting.
Fitz has a very firm skeptic hat. Mine's a bit looser. But all skeptics and hardcore believers alike are welcome in this space.
And of course, as we have said just now, and many times before, some of the best stories we get are from people that are hardcore skeptics. I don't believe in any of that rubbish, but and you get a corker of a story.
You do.
Well, I'm afraid that is all the listener stories we have for today's episode. Thank you so much to everyone that shared their personal experiences. And if anyone listening has an encounter that they would like to share, then please do get in touch through our website because we would love to hear it. But fear not, we are not finished yet. Hang on to your blankie and maybe replenish your tea and bickies because it's time for this episode's paranormal postcard, and we're about to take you on a journey to the world's end.
This episode, we're going on a little tour of our home county of Northamptonshire by visiting some of our most haunted pubs and discovering how they are all linked by one of the country's most turbulent periods in history, the English Civil War. Northamptonshire isn't a particularly well-known county of England, and if you have heard of it at all, then that may well be due to its claim to fame as the staging ground for one of the most influential battles in British history, the Battle of Naseby. Many historians agree that the Battle of Naseby is second only after the Battle of Hastings in terms of conflicts that changed the face of British history forever, and with good reason. Since the time of the Anglo-Saxons, right up until 1646, the kings and queens of England operated under a divine right to rule, meaning that even after the slight shift in power created by the Magna Carta in the 13th century, those of royal blood still held all the cards, an authority which was believed to be ordained by God and could not be questioned by mere mortals. And a particularly vehement believer of this divine right to rule was King Charles I, a belief that was to underpin the rumblings of dissent which ultimately led to civil war in England. But at our first location, we will meet that same king at an earlier and more peaceful time of his rule, not long after he married his queen, Henrietta Maria, the youngest sister of Louis XIII of France. Nowadays, the town of Wellingborough is an odd mix of tired modern buildings and the urban grimness of a rundown market town, but peppered all through with wonderful historical treasures, including several 17th century buildings, a 16th century half-timbered pub, a 15th century tithe barn, a 12th century church, and a thatched building believed to have foundations dating back to 1000 AD, amongst others. The town was established in the Saxon era as Wendel's Borough, meaning the settlement of the tribal leader Wendel. And I had always thought that the name Wendel's Borough had naturally transformed over the centuries into the modern name of Wellingborough. But I was surprised to learn that, in fact, the well in Wellingborough was not believed to be a contraction of Wendel after all, but to have come about because of a number of sacred wells in the town, reported to have healing properties, which made the town quite famous in the 17th century. So much so, in fact, that King Charles I and his queen Henrietta Maria spent a whole summer season camped out in Wellingborough near the town's famous Red Well. Northamptonshire antiquarian John Cole wrote in 1837, "Tradition has it that Wendlingborough was changed to Wellingborough in consequence of the celebrity of the Red Well." He described it as a chalybeate mineral spring, meaning that the water contained iron salts, presumably giving rise to the name of Red Well, as water rich in iron often has a reddish colour to it. Through the centuries, many of these iron-rich springs have come to be seen as sacred springs, either for their mineral content or the blood-like colour of the water, or both. Essex Dr. Benjamin Allen wrote in 1699 that the water from the Red Well weighed 18 grains lighter than common water in a quantity of about 12 ounces. Now, I don't know what that means for its supposed healing properties, but the royal couple must have been pleased with the results of their summer spent supping the waters of the spring, as they returned to visit again in later years, and there was even talk that the king would give Wellingborough the title of a royal spa town, and that could have resulted in a very different-looking history for the town, and maybe even the whole county. But until I started researching this episode, I had no idea of this connection to the 17th century royals, despite the place being so local to me. Instead, what Wellingborough is most famously known for is its connection to King Charles I's greatest adversary, the man who would be the king's undoing, Oliver Cromwell and his new model army. The ancient and modern are crammed together cheek by jowl in this town. Leaving a dull grey car park full of grocery shoppers hustling trolleys and heading towards the centre of town, visitors will have the green expanse of the manicured Croyland Abbey Gardens on their right, a space that has somehow retained the sense of peaceful reflection you might expect from grounds once frequented by monks. Ivy-covered sections of thick, crumbling stone walls hint at the monastic grange that existed here in the 13th century, and a handful of mature exotic trees dotted through the grounds are reminiscent of moneyed parkland. A modern sensory garden fills the area that was once a pond, and benches sit alongside an ancient stone coffin, retrieved from a nearby Roman settlement that someone in the 1920s thought to put to use as a garden planter. It's a pleasant place to rest and reflect. By day, at least. Come dusk, though, it's the sort of place you would want to scurry past, looking anxiously over your shoulder. At the end of the park is the confusingly named Croyland Abbey, a building originally dating back to 1281, which, as far as we know, was never actually an abbey. Despite the name, it was merely an outlying building owned by the Abbot of Lincolnshire, and was so named after Croyland Abbey of that county. But there were monks here, and local historians Joyce and Morris Palmer hint in their 1972 book that some of those monks may still remain, buried in a vault under the floor. A 19th century hall with a wooden veranda has been built facing the park, butted up against the old monastic grange behind. And these two historic buildings stand pinched on either side by two startlingly ugly modern office blocks, one of the particularly distasteful 60s concrete variety, the other now being used as residential flats. And yet, around the very next corner, we come face to face with the medieval tithe barn that once took receipt of the manorial tithes, a kind of tax that originally consisted of parish residents giving produce such as grain, wool, or animals to the church. A long thatched hall striped with alternating bands of brown ironstone and lighter limestone, punctuated with sturdy buttresses and two huge barn doors that have long since been blocked up. Inside, you can see straight up to the pitch of the high, long roof, the huge wooden beams exposed like the ribs of some great marine creature. In the street outside, patches of cobblestones are underfoot, worn smooth by centuries of passing feet, and Victorian gas lamp-style streetlights line the path, contrasting weirdly with the grim office block windows glaring down over the otherwise picturesque little historic courtyard. And a little further on still, just as we spill out onto the busy main street thrumming with shoppers and traffic, we come across another historical treasure. A wide, columned porch topped with a golden statue of a regal-looking deer, fronting a golden-brown ironstone building with gabled ends at each corner and dormer attic windows presiding over the lower two floors. The many rooms within are given away by a series of windows, glinting like so many curious eyes, in that distinctive bendy light effect that only old leaded windows can produce. And if you happen to glance up at the central window overlooking the junction of Sheep Street and Market Street, you might just spot an indistinct figure peering back out at you through the wavering reflections in the old glass, as this is where just one of the ghosts we'll meet today has been seen. Around the side, a single black and white half-timbered room is perched precariously and somewhat wonkily above a wide archway into a central courtyard that speaks of the days of coaching inns and highwaymen. This is the Hind Hotel, named after Sir Francis Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, and the golden deer featured in the coat of arms of Drake's sponsor, Sir Christopher Hatton. And a coaching inn it was indeed, being home in the 1800s to the Hind Flyer, a famous coach service that ran to London 5 times a week, leaving at 5 a.m. and completing the journey in one day. But its fame, and at least one of its many ghosts, stem from a much earlier time, the year of 1645, the year of the Battle of Naseby.
A lot had happened since King Charles and Queen Henrietta Maria's visits to Wellingborough between 1626 and 1628, and things hadn't gone so well for the king. Charles I was not a much-loved monarch. During a time in England when Catholic Mass was banned, the king married a Roman Catholic queen and tried to push his favoured form of High Anglican worship, a practice with much ritual that some felt was a little too close to Catholicism for comfort. He also had a bit of a spending problem and didn't manage the royal finances terribly well, spending lavishly and recklessly on new palaces, art collections, and on waging unnecessary wars, the cost of which he had no compunction in passing on to his subjects. One of many things that caused a great deal of friction between not only the king and his people, but also the king and his parliament. At that time, MPs didn't really have an awful lot of power in court, but the one tool in their belt was that the king had to seek Parliament's agreement before enforcing new taxes, and the summoning of Parliament for this purpose was an important opportunity for MPs to wrangle for new proposals or bills with this small amount of leverage. Charles, however, was not very willing to make these types of compromises, despite needing MPs on his side in order to refill the rapidly emptying royal coffers. The king took great issue with MPs opposing his taxes, whilst the MPs themselves grew increasingly frustrated with the financial and religious tensions the monarch was creating both in this country and abroad. And so the clashes between the Crown and Parliament grew increasingly incendiary until, in 1629, the king got in such a strop that he dismissed Parliament and didn't recall it for another 11 years. Although we now know this time as the period of personal rule, in history it had been referred to by Charles's opponents as the 11-year tyranny, a clear indication of the unpopularity of his decision. Of course, without calling Parliament, he couldn't raise money for his wars by imposing new taxes. But he found sly ways around this, such as the exploitation of forest laws, forced loans, and a scheme known as ship money, by which he used an old law originally intended for coastal counties to provide ships to the crown. Only he levied it as a money tax on all counties, including inland ones. As you can imagine, none of this made him any more popular. Things came to a head when the monarch tried to meddle in the religious practices of Scotland, which provoked waves of riots throughout Scotland and resulted in the Bishops' Wars, conflicts which the king did not do well in. Scottish forces known as the Covenanters rose up and swiftly defeated Charles's troops, but far from conceding victory, the king instead finally recalled Parliament to ask for more money to continue the fighting. But by this time, after 11 years of being dismissed from Parliament, MPs had a laundry list of grievances that they were set on airing before agreeing to any of the king's demands for huge sums of war money. It did not go well. After only 3 weeks and no resolutions, the monarch once again dismissed Parliament in a cloud of righteous anger. The result was a poorly trained and even more poorly paid English army that faced the Scots in the Second Bishops' War, a force headed up by Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford. The English army lost once again as the Covenanters invaded England and took Newcastle, leaving the king humiliated and desperate, and Thomas Wentworth in the firing line from both sides. Charles really had no choice now but to recall Parliament once more, and they swiftly pushed through legislation that meant the king could no longer dismiss Parliament on a whim, and that it must be called at least once every 3 years. But still, grievances were barely simmering under the surface, and several MPs actually drew up a list of these grievances regarding Charles's rule, which became known as the Great Remonstrance. the heart of the capital city was becoming a tinderbox ready to ignite, and one character who became the spark that helped set it all alight was the commander of the ill-fated English forces who lost to Scotland in the Bishop's Wars, Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford. Strafford had once been vocally opposed to the king's policies, but all that had changed when the king offered him a barony and appointed him Lord President of the North of England. The sudden shift in alignment made other MPs wary of Strafford's seemingly contrary behaviour, and Strafford became an even more contentious figure after Charles's failed wars with the Covenanters. In fact, the Earl was advised to leave the country for his own safety, but the king convinced him to stay. Presumably seeing a pliable ally in Strafford, Charles promised the Earl that no harm would come to him whilst he was by the king's side. A promise that would come back to haunt the king later, in a very literal sense. Strafford then made a move which was to seal his own fate. He offered to summon the Irish army on behalf of the king to quell the uprisings of Parliament. As you can imagine, this did not go down well in the House of Commons. They had the Earl of Strafford impeached and eventually managed to force King Charles to sign the death warrant of his own advisor, to whom he had so rashly promised that no harm would come. Things from then on just went from bad to worse. The king attempted to arrest the 5 MPs who were connected to the Grand Remonstrance list of grievances against the monarch, bursting into the House of Commons with 400 armed men and accusing them of treason. The MPs had actually been tipped off and escaped on a barge out of the city in the nick of time, but this left the king humiliated and furious, and demanding that the City of London hand over the wanted men. The Guildhall refused, giving a clear message that by invading the sacrosanct space of the House of Commons, the king had gone a step too far, and that the City of London sided with Parliament, not their king. This was the tipping point, the point of no return, as royalists and parliamentarians began to arm up and muster, and England headed into civil war.
By 1645, the Civil War had been rumbling on for 3 years. Many battles had been fought, thousands of lives had been lost, and the king's army wasn't doing so well. At the end of 1644, the parliamentary army had a massive shake-up, which produced what we now know as the New Model Army. In the past, armies of both the monarch and his opposition were commanded by MPs and courtiers. Basically, you could buy yourself a title like Major or General within the ranks of the military with money, land, or royal favour. But this meant that a lot of the time, those commanding the war efforts had little military experience or expertise. Soldiers lower down the ranks were untrained, often unpaid, and sometimes even poorly armed and fed, and the whole debacle resulted in some pretty chaotic battles. But in December of 1644, parliamentarian Oliver Cromwell argued in a famous speech that the war against the crown would never be resolved unless Parliament's military resources were improved. The result of this was something called self-denying ordnance. Basically, all MPs in a position of military power had to give up their commands. They had to choose between political power or military power. In theory at least, making way for commanders free of political bias and with appropriate military knowledge and experience, who could train a competent and efficient army, who were properly paid and willing and able to travel wherever the fight took them. Of course, it wasn't quite as simple and smooth as that in its execution, and ironically, Cromwell himself ended up being the exception to his own idea when he retained political power and was later also promoted to military leader. But the idea birthed what became known as the New Model Army, and the move did start to turn the tide against the Royalist forces. By June of 1645, Cromwell and Thomas Fairfax's New Model Army were marching north towards what would become the decisive battle of the First English Civil War. And it was then that local legend states that the Parliamentarian army stopped for food and rest at the Hind Hotel in Wellingborough. For many years, I thought that this was likely a myth, happily kept alive by generations of publicans to add a bit of historical fame and intrigue to the 17th century hotel and bar and attract curious visitors. Especially when I discovered that in 1645, the year that Cromwell supposedly visited, the Hind Hotel was recorded by contemporaries as being in build, meaning, I presumed, under construction. But in fact it was not being built, but rather rebuilt, or maybe extensively renovated. From the records available, we can't quite be sure. But we do know that a much older inn already stood on this site, and the structure we see today was either built on top of or around it, which makes it much more reasonable that an army, or its commanders at any rate, could have rested here. It also turns out that there is, or was at least, actually evidence to support this. It seems that there was a document in the possession of a local man confirming the parliamentarian's visit to the inn, signed in Cromwell's handwriting, and asking that forage might be prepared for his troops there at that juncture. This was reported to have been exhibited in Wellingborough in the mid-19th century, but sadly, it seems to have been lost along the passing decades. Some evidence was definitely recorded, however, in a town book of Wellingborough, which records a transaction by Cromwell's general in 1645 of £1, 0 shillings and 0 pence, paid towards a charge laid upon the 100 of 20 fat sheep and 3 fat heifers for General Thomas Fairfax's army. A sum of about £200 today, according to the Bank of England's inflation calculator. So this certainly does seem to place the parliamentarians at the Hind as they travelled north to meet the king's army. But we don't really know much more than the fact that they were there. We don't know if Old Ironsides himself actually stayed at the inn, how long the army or its commanders might have rested there, or how long the 20 sheep and 3 cows were supposed to have lasted them. But local legends and ghost stories have sought to fill in the blanks for many generations. The first thing that most bar staff at the Hind, past and present, will tell you is that they do not like the cellar. For years there have been rumours that a secret escape tunnel used to run from the bar cellar to nearby Croyland Abbey, something we hear a lot from buildings dating back to the years when religious and political persecution was rife. Apparently there has never been any evidence found in the Abbey cellars that this may be the case, but past bar staff say that there is an area in the cellars of the Hind that does look very much like a bricked-up tunnel. In fact, there are even holes in the brickwork through which you can peer into the unfathomable blackness of the cavity beyond. No wonder rumours abounded about some poor souls being bricked up alive in there when it was sealed off. Whether there is any truth to the rumour or not, a particularly creepy feeling in the area seems to make staff want to spend as little time down there as possible. But even if there aren't escape tunnels, then there certainly is an escape hatch in what's probably the most haunted room of the building. Of course, in a hotel so associated with the parliamentarian leader, there had to be a Cromwell suite, a room with carved ceiling beams, wood-panelled walls, and a fireplace. And the 1972 book, A History of Wellingborough from Roman Times to the Present Day, describes a secret escape hatch built into the wooden panelling of the room.
There is a hidden recess which is brought to light by running a hand down the carving to the right of the fireplace. A soft click, and the door swings open to reveal a kind of shelfless cupboard.
The authors explained that by the 1970s it was boarded up, but years ago this hidden cupboard was actually an escape route out onto the roof. No doubt a very useful secret passageway in the turbulent times in which the inn was constructed, and it makes one wonder how many desperate souls fled from here in the depths of night. And it seems that some of this uneasy energy may have lingered, for the Cromwell room has been the focus of some rather disturbing poltergeist activity. In the late 1970s, a member of staff staying in the room next door reported that they were kept awake all night by the sounds of furniture moving around by itself in the Cromwell room. Traditionally, the unexplained noises and movement have been blamed on a white lady ghost, who is said to frequent the inn between late September and early October. And local legend says that the restless phantom is that of a serving girl who worked at the inn when Fairfax and Cromwell's troops were staying in 1645. The story goes that the commanders were busy plotting their strategy for engaging the royal army, when a serving girl was discovered listening into their plans. Whether she was a royalist spy or just being nosy, we'll never know. But according to the tale, they decided that they could not let her live with the knowledge she had gained, and murdered her in cold blood. If there's any grain of truth to this, then it's perhaps no wonder that the girl occasionally kicks up an angry racket in the building, and, like so many hauntings, she seems to get particularly upset when there's any kind of building work going on.
The problems ramped up when management of the Hind was taken over in 1978, and the inn was temporarily closed for repairs. The resident spirits were apparently none too happy with the new arrangements and seemed to take an immediate dislike to the new manager. It started with objects moving, seemingly of their own accord. Furniture and flower displays were discovered moved from the position they'd been left in, something easily written off perhaps, as the type of objects easily moved by other staff. But then the manager moved some old rifles into his flat on the first floor. The next morning they had been moved too, and that was not so easily explained away. The atmosphere grew more and more unpleasant. Other staff witnessed lights dimming, flickering, and turning themselves on and off. One barman couldn't stand it anymore and actually resigned. But still, the new manager seemed the focus of attention, and as events reached a crescendo, he watched on helplessly as glass ashtrays exploded in front of his eyes. And worse, a tumbler and a bottle full of liquid flew straight at him, one object hitting him on the head. It doesn't seem to have been recorded anywhere whether the poor manager took his leave or stuck it out with the poltergeist. Or maybe the repair work finished and the activity simply subsided, as so often happens in these cases. I didn't come across any more recent reports of such alarming activity, although staff have admitted to experiencing such an uneasy feeling about the room that they flat out refused to go in. But whether or not that particular presence still lingers, that certainly wasn't an end to the haunting of the Hind Hotel. And thankfully, not all its resident ghosts are quite so unpleasant. One in particular seems to hail from a much happier and more peaceful time, and is considered more a benign shade from the past than a disruptive presence. In the first half of the 19th century, it was so common for staff to encounter the gentle spirit known as Old Mrs. Pretty that should they pass her shade as it roamed the corridors, they would simply nod and go about their day, as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Dorothy Priest records in her 2008 book Haunted Inns of Northamptonshire that this kindly ghost had not been encountered for a long while at the time of publication, and neither does she seem to have made any appearances at the multiple ghost hunting events and vigils that have been held at the hotel over more recent years. One spirit that is still encountered, however, is that of a little girl ghost who frequents the inn's restaurant. If you were to stay overnight at the Hind and happen to wander the dark, narrow corridors in the wee hours, you may find yourself drawn to the warm light of a side lamp that's been left on in the low-ceilinged, wooden-beamed restaurant. In fact, this lamp is always supposed to be kept on at night, or so staff say, because should it be turned off, the quiet sounds of a child sobbing can be heard emanating from one corner of the room. And sometimes, in the dark corners of that room, an odd shape can be seen under one of the tables, the small hunched-up shape of a young girl hiding in the shadows. Two staff relate having seen the little girl ghost in the restaurant at the time of Priest's 2007 book, and she seems to be one of the hotel spirits still encountered on investigations up to the present day. A past employee spoke on a recent podcast called Wailingborough, a local ghost story podcast, about how a paranormal team investigating at the Hind had experienced the tablecloth on the restaurant table associated with the little girl moving of its own accord. There are various theories as to why the young spirit is often heard crying. Some believe she is a restless soul because she died from a fall down the hotel's 17th century staircase. Others say that she gets upset if the light is turned off, simply because she is afraid of the dark. Thankfully, not all encounters with the child spirit are so sad. Other staff have been working in the restaurant when they have felt something unseen brush past them, a light touch on their hand, and the sound of a little giggle issuing from empty space. But what of the phantom that stands in an upstairs window gazing out at the busy street below? Well, this apparition is known as the Grey Lady and is said to haunt room number 3. No one seems to know much about her or why she might remain at the inn, but she seems to be felt more often than seen, with multiple guests commenting on the eerie atmosphere of the room, and several flat out refusing to stay in it. One guest who did try to stay in the room apparently gave up partway through the night, but couldn't bring themselves to ask for a different room, presumably because that would mean admitting exactly why they had fled the one they had booked. They spent a sleepless night in the hotel's reception and only revealed that they'd been unable to stick it out due to the disturbing atmosphere of room 3 as they checked out of the hotel the next day. Investigation group Paranormal Eye mention people having experiences of a woman in white who knocks on the hotel room doors before disappearing. Could this be the Grey Lady from room 3? If so, it could mean that she still is encountered in the hotel even today. Or perhaps this is another apparition entirely. In recent years, more and more spirits seem to have come into the mix, as paranormal investigators have had their own experiences. It's little wonder that some claim to have seen the ghost of Cromwell himself, whilst more unusually, Others claim to have seen the apparition of a cavalier soldier, which seems less in keeping with a place so famously associated with their mortal enemies, the Roundheads. Another recent addition to the motley collection of spirits is the sighting of ghostly monks, and this is less surprising to me. In fact, I've been more surprised not to have found far more encounters with ghostly monks in the area, given the inn's close proximity to, and links with, Croyland Abbey, where, despite it not being an actual abbey, we know there were monks in residence for many years. The Palmer's book, A History of Wellingborough, tells us that the Hind was originally built as a quadrangle, with a 10-foot entranceway on the market side and a matching exit on the opposite side, meaning that one side opened directly onto the Croyland Abbey estate. I wonder if any hotel guests over the years have looked out of an upstairs window at the moonlit Abbey gardens below, or maybe down into the cobbled street by the old Tithe barn, and noticed any hooded figures drifting along silently. I wonder if they would even notice that they were seeing something out of time and place. I know I would certainly love the opportunity to spend the night in the panelled Cromwell room, with the secret priest hole hidden by the fireplace. Maybe peer down the dimly lit narrow hallways for signs of a pale female figure drifting along, or the bustling figure of old Mrs. Priddy. Or maybe, just maybe, sneaking down to the dining room and listening for the light sound of giggling coming from under a shadowy table. But this is only the beginning of our journey, as the parliamentarians' stay in Wellingborough was but brief, and they were soon moving onwards to face the royal army. And for a time, we'll follow along with them, as we find the next legend left in the wake of the Civil War, in the nearby town of Wilby, and another historic haunted pub.
In May of 1645, the Royalist army sacked Leicester, and the brutality of the attack upon not only the opposing army, but also the city's innocent citizens would go down in history as one of the most heinous acts of the Civil War. After storming Leicester, the King's army turned south to march towards the Royalist stronghold of Oxford, to which the parliamentarians were laying siege. As news spread of the horrors inflicted upon Leicester's residents at the hands of the King's men, other parliamentarian towns grew fearful that they would be next, particularly those such as Northampton that lay on the southern route back to Oxford. In fact, word was sent to Thomas Fairfax's army to abandon their siege on Oxford and move north to intercept the Royalist forces, hoping to stave off another attack like the one on Leicester, and maybe even take advantage of the King's army being tired and depleted after their raid. Of course, some of Fairfax's troops must also have had revenge on their minds. And so the parliamentarian army marched north, stopping, as we have seen, at the Hind in Wellingborough before moving on. But they didn't move on very far before they made another Northamptonshire village a place of legend, the village of Wilby, wherein lies our next haunted pub. Wilby is one of those little villages that doesn't extend much beyond the main road running through it. It's been around a long time, judging by Roman and Iron Age artefacts found in the area, and it makes an appearance in the Domesday Book. But aside from that, and some details about an interesting 13th century church, I had a very hard time finding much on its history at all. It seems to be one of those places that has just ticked on by over the centuries, never really gaining much attention, and apparently being passed over by all the local antiquarians if my research is anything to go by, the only exception being the legend of the George Inn. Set back from the main road, and at a lower level that requires a flight of steps down to the jauntily bright red painted front porch, the George takes up a good length of the main road. The main section of the pub is a 2-storey slate-roofed building with 2 attic rooms and 2 chimney pots, one at either end. The walls sporting the classic local mottled and striped ironstone and limestone mix. This same building material is used for an even longer low barn at the other end of the plot, and squashed between the two is a small cottage-like building with walls painted a slate grey colour and a slightly sagging roof. The outside looks cheery with colourful sun umbrellas and bunting, an age-softened stone wall circling the pub garden, accessed through a little wooden gate in the wall just to the left of the front door. A sign over the gate reads, "The Secret Garden," and it's actually what lies beyond this closed gate that I'm most interested in. Luckily for me, I can see over the walls straight into the garden from the footpath, and at the centre of the pub garden is what I am looking for, what I was desperately hoping was in fact still here. An old tree. Its broad, gnarled trunk bent over so far that the whole tree keels sideways in danger of toppling over. Sturdy wooden posts have been wedged between the trunk and the grass to prop it up, like the walking sticks of a venerable elder, presiding as it does over not just the garden, but the expansive view of rolling Northamptonshire countryside beyond. I wonder how much that view has changed since this tree has been looking out over it. The thick head of lush green foliage belies the tree's years, for if the legend is to be believed, this tree is supposedly around 450 years old. The local legend tells that on the day before the Battle of Naseby, the parliamentarian forces left the Hind in Wellingborough and travelled half a day before stopping at the early 16th century George Inn at Wilby, where they held a meeting under a mulberry tree. For centuries, this meeting of the Roundhead leaders, stopping to plan their advancement towards the King's army, is thought to have taken place under the very tree that now stoops and bows in the George's pub garden, a tree that also mysteriously bears the name, the Hanging Tree, according to the Haunted Inns of Northamptonshire book. Unfortunately, the author gives no further information on how the ancient mulberry tree got the macabre nickname of the Hanging Tree. Although, if it is as old as the legend suggests, there's really no reason why that name wouldn't have been quite literal in nature, given that it would already have been 100 or so years old by the time of the Battle of Naseby. There are a few other problems with this story, though. The first being the part where Fairfax's army travelled half a day to reach the George from Wellingborough. Having walked that journey myself, I can tell you that it's only about 2 miles, so they must really have been dragging their feet for it to have taken them that long. The second is that I can find no record of the inn dating back as far as 1645, and certainly not the early 16th century. It is a listed building, meaning that it's noted to be of historical significance, but the only dates I could find put the building at a date of the early 18th century. However, I don't think this debunks the myth entirely. I've very often found that historical listings, especially such brief ones as I found in this case, often miss listing details of earlier buildings when a current structure has been built on or around an earlier incarnation. And sometimes those details are only recorded in local knowledge and lore. And regardless of how old the building is, there's nothing to indicate that the mulberry tree wouldn't have been there for Fairfax and Cromwell to plot under. Nor does it mean that the pub itself isn't haunted, for of course, a building doesn't need to date back to the 17th century to be home to some ghostly goings-on. And just like our last haunted inn, The George seems too to suffer from strange sounds and poltergeist-like activity. Only their poltergeist particularly seems to like meddling with doors and windows. The door to an attic room is frequently found open, despite the owners keeping it latched and locked. The windows in the long barn, which now operates as a bed and breakfast, are often found flung open after having been left securely closed by staff. The owners related to author Dorothy Priest that not only would they witness the barn doors swing open of their own accord several times a day, but that they would also be able to hear the click of the latch lifting just before they swung open, as if lifted by an invisible and mischievous hand. More frightening, though, are the sounds that come from the cellar. Loud banging and crashing as though someone is down there, rolling the huge heavy barrels around and smashing them together. Of course, no one is ever found down there to be the cause, and the barrels are far too unwieldy for one person to throw around in this way on their own anyway. A chef who previously worked at the inn was so disturbed by these noises that they refused to ever enter the cellar again. But it's not only phantom noises that haunt the inn. An actual apparition has been spotted too, roaming the front bar. You might think that in a creaky old pub like this, it would be easy to jump at shadows in the middle of the night. But actually, this apparition is seen in broad daylight. One member of staff, spotting a figure he thought must be the landlord, called out in greeting as he moved through the pub. The landlord responded to them all right, but their voice did not come from where the figure was standing. It came from the basement, where the landlord had been working for some time. The mysterious figure instantly disappeared, leaving the member of staff wondering exactly who or what they had been sharing the room with. Some think that these hauntings may be related to an eccentric landlord from the 1960s, affectionately known by locals as Mad Jack. And even if it isn't Jack himself that is returning in spirit form to rattle barrels and mess with the doors and windows, I can certainly see how such a character would have only added some chaotic energy to the layers of history within the building. Apparently, Jack kept to his own peculiar schedule of changing into his pyjamas at 10 p.m. sharp and then continuing to serve behind the bar in his bedtime attire until last orders, which, to be fair, seems only mildly eccentric. But perhaps more alarmingly, he enjoyed cleaning the inn's chimneys by shooting his rifle up them, exploding soot and bits of flea-riddled abandoned birds' nests all over any unfortunate nearby customers. Of course, the inn has changed hands many times since then, but as I stand outside on the public footpath, taking a few photos of the front of this locally famous pub, a woman in an apron comes angrily storming out of the front door, stance hostile and demanding to know what on earth I'm doing taking photos of the pub. It's a historic building, and I like history, I mumbled, dumbfounded and slightly shaky at the bizarre, almost accusation. Oh, that's all right then, love, she replies, sweetly as pie, and spins on her heel in a masterful change of character that the Royal Shakespeare Company would have been proud of. We had been planning to sit in the garden for a drink and maybe sample the menu while we admired the legendary mulberry tree, but that swiftly put any such thoughts out of our minds. Maybe there is something of Mad Jack lingering in the inn after all. Reluctant to stay and find out, we beat a hasty retreat to the coffee-mobile before the George could throw any more colourful characters our way.
Having left Fairfax and the parliamentarians marching north to intercept the Royalists, we now catch up with King Charles, who is moving south from Leicester, heading towards Oxford to defend his stronghold. Pausing at Market Harbour to replenish his depleted troops and supplies before reaching Daventry, just 15 miles from where the Battle of Naseby would take place. But little did Charles know that his fate would be sealed at that place in just a few days' time, as he rested his head at the Wheatsheaf Inn, and his troops were encamped on the nearby Iron Age hill fort of Borough Hill. Now, we have briefly mentioned the famous incident at Daventry's Wheatsheaf before, a long time ago in an earlier episode, but this story wouldn't be complete without a deeper dive into the foreboding encounters King Charles I experienced at this 17th century coaching inn. The legend goes that by the time the royal entourage reached Daventry, the king was aware that Fairfax and his troops were closing in fast, with Cromwell on his way to join them. His own soldiers were weary after the siege of Leicester, and their numbers diminished. The new model army was a formidable force, and the number of parliamentarians currently hot on his tail were greater than his own numbers. But the victory in Leicester buoyed feelings within the ranks that the war must be going in their favour, a feeling vocally echoed by the king's nephew and commander of the royalist cavalry, Prince Rupert, who made it clear that he thought the best course of action was to face off against the Roundheads. The king seemed not so certain, and tarried a while wondering what best to do. Even so, they were all rather surprised and disappointed, when instead he gave the orders to march back to Market Harborough, retracing their steps from whence they'd just come. But what most of them didn't know was that the king had been convinced that engaging the enemy would be catastrophic by a very unexpected guest. In the late 1800s, Alfred T. Story published some accounts and poetic retellings of events in Northamptonshire's history that were later collected together in book form, published in 1883 under the title Historical Legends of Northamptonshire. In it, he relates the events that took place at the Wheatsheaf on one June night in 1645, just days before the Battle of Naseby, when the king's attendants heard a commotion coming from his chambers and rushed to his aid, thinking perhaps he was being attacked, only to find him sitting up in bed, pale and trembling, but completely alone.
But in the midmost watches of the night, what was it that waked him in a fright? The king's heart leapt, as in the dim light he beheld the dead and awful front of Strafford. "What?" he cried, "I thought thou hast died." "Ay, liege, my king, I did. Men die indeed who trust in princes' favour. Yet came I not to chide you, but to bid, if so I may, that you no longer waver, but hie you northward, for there's close at hand one you shall ne'er o'ercome with armed band."
Those keen of ear and memory might realise just who this ghostly apparition was that chose to haunt the king that night. None other than his favourite adviser, the Earl of Strafford, the same Earl of Strafford whose death warrant the king had signed, leading to the courtier's execution for treason 4 years earlier. No wonder the king was surprised. It's one thing to be awoken by a ghost in the middle of the night, but it's quite another to find yourself faced with a man to whom you promised no harm would come in your service, and then promptly had him executed. Nevertheless, apart from a somewhat understandable jibe about the king getting Strafford offed, the ghostly apparition seemed to have good intentions towards his monarch, only dropping in to implore him not to engage the parliamentarian army, for he said it was a battle they couldn't win. Sufficiently shaken, Charles was ready to do as his adviser bid him, dead or not. But Prince Rupert didn't think much of heeding advice that came from beyond the grave, and managed to convince the monarch that it was nothing more than the equivalent of a cheese-fueled nightmare from unwise choices at dinner. The Royalist army steeled themselves to clash with the Roundheads once more, but Strafford was to prove surprisingly tenacious for a dead man, for when the king went to bed the next night.
But ere soft sleep his eyelids downward pressed, the ghostly form of yesternight appeared, and with majestic mien, though angry brow, foretold the sad monarch how the day would come, and right soon he feared, when he would rue most keen. His ghostly counsels slighted, for, said he, your cause is blighted, beyond retrieve, if but another day you tarry here.
Strafford's phantom warned that this was the last time he'd be able to give the king his otherworldly counsel, and urged him to head north instead of engaging the enemy, for if he did, all would be lost. Charles was spooked enough to heed the warning, but once again, when the monarch related events to Prince Rupert the next morning, his nephew was less than impressed. Being pulled in two such opposite directions by his advisors, both dead and alive, the king struggled to make a decision and dithered at the wheat sheaf for another day, before the ill portents finally got the better of him and they gave the order to head north. Sadly for us, the wheat sheaf is one inn that we couldn't visit. Built in Daventry in 1610, the Coaching Inn still stands today, albeit with some more modern rebuilds and renovation over the years. A 3-story whitewash building designed around a central courtyard, with its wide carriage entrance now gated. It's said to still contain its 17th century staircase, and the same wood panelling that Charles I himself would have seen. But it rang its final last orders back in 1990, and since then has been used as a care home for the elderly. The bedroom where the king encountered the apparition of Strafford having been divided into 2 separate rooms. However, that ghostly encounter from nearly 400 years ago does seem to have left a strange energy in its wake. It's reported that a distinct chill is felt between the 6th and the 26th of June in the 2 rooms that once made up the king's bedroom, with one lady actually witnessing a ghostly apparition in one of those rooms back in 1968, when the inn still served as a hotel, and it was seen over the course of 2 nights, just as Strafford himself had appeared. The visitor awoke in the depths of night. Looking around for what had disturbed her slumber, she was startled to see a figure standing in a shadowy corner. It would have been easy to wonder if it was just a trick of the light, except that as she watched, the apparition started to move, passing from the corner of the room to the door. A less hardy soul would have been at the reception desk by first light, asking for a different room, but this guest was obviously built of sterner stuff. On the second night, the lady sat up waiting to see if the spirit would appear again, determined to stay awake and keep watch. Her vigil paid off when she suddenly felt a permeating chill, and there, right in front of her, was a figure sitting on the bed. She described it as sitting in a drooping position, suggesting a resigned or mournful posture perhaps. Who knows what was going through her mind, or whether she was gearing up to flee, but before she could react at all, the figure vanished in front of her eyes. More recently, it doesn't seem as though the spirit of the wheat sheaf has made any appearances, although a spokesperson for the care home told a local newspaper that staff did occasionally feel spooked at night in the building. Maybe Strafford made his last appearance in the 1960s, although I couldn't help but notice that they didn't ask whether any of the care home residents themselves had seen him, so you never know. At the king's orders, the royalist army left their encampment on Borough Hill and started marching back towards Market Harbour. Of course, with an army of this size, they weren't all marching together in one huge cluster, but were variously spread out around the surrounding countryside, with some scouting for the enemy, others for supplies and horses. And so, on the 13th of June, whilst Prince Rupert had made it to Market Harbour, the king himself was staying at a manor house in Lubnham to the west. A party of the king's lifeguard brought up the rear to the south. At this time, they were somewhere around the little village of Naseby, where unbeknownst to them was a band of the new model army. Some accounts say that the king's lifeguard were surprised whilst playing quoits. Others that they were dining around a table, now said to be kept in Naseby Church. Either way, the parliamentarians sprung an ambush on them, and most of them were captured, only a few men escaping to warn the king's army that Fairfax's soldiers had just struck the first blow. The news reached the monarch in the early hours of the morning, and Strafford's warning must have been ringing in the king's ears.
"For," he said, "your cause is blighted beyond retrieve if but another day you tarry here."
If Charles hadn't spent another day dithering at Daventry, wondering whether to turn tail or face the fight, maybe his men might have made it far enough north to escape the surprise attack by Fairfax's soldiers at Naseby. But now he would have no choice but to turn and fight a battle that his dead advisor said he couldn't win. And fight they did, at Naseby Fields on the 14th of June 1645, a day that would leave an indelible mark on both the history books and on the landscape.
We've covered the Battle of Naseby in a previous episode and told the story of how that fateful battleground was left haunted by apparitions, replaying the grisly events in the skies over Naseby battlefield every year on the anniversary of the clash. So we won't cover it again here, although there was one little nugget that I didn't turn up for that episode, a paranormal blooper of sorts that I couldn't resist sharing. The Penguin Book of Ghosts Haunted England records the words of one Reverend John Mastin, writing in about 1792 of his experience when he first came to the village of Naseby and was told the following anecdote by the master of the local Bell public house.
Some years ago, on a Shrove Tuesday, 2 women of the village had a violent dispute in the churchyard. From words they proceeded to blows and fought most furiously, when a man who was shot at the Battle of Naseby came out of a grave and parted them.
Suitably shocked, the Reverend determined to discover what on earth had occurred in this village so haunted by the Civil War battle. But what he discovered was altogether a more earthly affair than the publican would have him believe. In fact, the man who broke up the fight was shot at the Battle of Naseby. He'd been a quartermaster fighting in the Royalist army at the time. But he had survived and happened to be in the churchyard while the women were fighting, because after the war he became a parish clerk and sexton, and at the time of the argument he'd been busy digging a grave in the churchyard, not clawing his way out of one with undead hands. This anecdote tickled me as a timely reminder that even people in the 18th century didn't take themselves too seriously and could have a joke about the paranormal, but also that the Civil War battle was still very much itself an apparition in the minds of Naseby residents for many, many years after the fact. But for us now, it's time to move on to our last haunted pub of this journey. And, slightly confusingly, it's actually the first one we visited, when we decided one fine sunny day to take an afternoon off and indulge in that very British pastime of a pub garden lunch with ghosts. The location of our last stop is quite different from our first, despite being only 5 miles away from where we started this journey. Ecton is a picturesque little village that has not suffered the indignities of concrete office blocks and multi-storey car parks that Wellingborough has. Instead, its few winding streets contain only houses, including some quaint thatched cottages, a school, a 13th century church, a village green, and 2 pubs, one of which was a family forge once worked by the ancestors of Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers of the United States of America. But that's not the pub we've come to visit today. Instead, we pull up opposite the village green, in the car park of the World's End, and seat ourselves on an outdoor deck overlooking a pretty walled garden under the dappled shade of mature trees. We passed the front of the pub on the main road side, its swinging sign painted with a Civil War lobster-tailed pot cavalry helmet held aloft in a gloved hand. But in fact, the front and back of the pub have been reversed over the years, and where we sit now at the rear would have once been the front entrance and looked out over a coaching, toll or turnpike road. From both sides, though, it's clear to see the patchwork hodgepodge of buildings, added to, renovated and built around over the centuries. The softly rounded, pockmarked yellow lias stone of the main 2-storey building and adjoining low barn are abutted by modern extensions. Someone has done their very best to match the stone and blend in a sympathetic build, but the too smooth, too square stone still can't quite hide its 20th century origin. 3 dormer attic windows and 3 chimney pots grace the slate roof of the main 18th century building, and at the front, the sill and outline of a bricked-up window from an earlier time sits nested within the outline of a wide bricked-up carriage archway, presumably from a different, earlier time? My brain does flip-flops trying to figure out which one came first, but it's soon distracted by fresh coffee and an appealing menu, featuring dairy-free ice cream, and we all know by now that you should always go back for ice cream. Thankfully, the reception we received here was much warmer than our baffling encounter at the George. The staff at the World's End pub were welcoming and helpful, and did their best to wrangle their menu to fit our complicated list of dietary requirements, all whilst we were both thoroughly distracted, eyes roaming the windows for any fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures or pale, ghostly faces peering down at us. You may be wondering by now how an 18th century building fits into our Civil War narrative. Well, like so many other pubs we've met on this journey, this current structure was not the first incarnation of the World's End. Whilst the structure we see today was either built or rebuilt in the mid-1700s, there was an inn on this land before that time, which started life as a malt mill and grain store, as far back as at least 1620, but very possibly for many years before that. Wonderfully for us, a keen historian and descendant of an Ecton yeoman who owned the land of the World's End back in the 16th century, has done an amazing job digging through parish records to track the inn's journey from brewer's mill to pub. Which is important because whenever you read an account of the World's End story, there seems to be some confusion, particularly over its name. And to find out why, we need to return to Naseby and the aftermath of the battle, as the musket smoke starts to clear the mud-churned fields, looters descend like vultures to pick the fallen clean of their valuables, and the victorious parliamentarians round up their prisoners of war.
War, of course, is an ugly, devastating business, no matter how far removed we are in time or space, and the English Civil War was certainly no exception. As each army formed up atop their respective ridges on the morning of 14th of June 1645, between 7 and 9,000 Royalist troops faced off against the Parliamentarians' 13 or 14,000. When all was said and done, and the Royalists had suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the new model army, both sides had lost significant numbers, some dead, some taken hostage. The king's forces suffered the worst, with over 1,000 killed in battle and another 5,000 rounded up as prisoners of war, many of whom were seriously wounded. So what was to become of them? Well, the war wasn't over. Naseby is famous for being the battle that forever tipped the First English Civil War in favour of the Parliamentarians, because the Royalist army could simply never recover from the huge numbers of men lost. But King Charles escaped that day, and the First Civil War continued for another year until the monarch eventually sought refuge with the Scottish Covenanters, thinking that they would give him a better deal than the English Parliament. Now, I know what you're thinking, and you're not wrong. That's the same Scottish Covenanters who Charles was at war with just a few years ago for trying to stick a heavy hand into their religious practices and kicking off the bishops' wars. So, on paper, it doesn't sound like a great plan. He had his political reasons, but if you were thinking that you wouldn't be surprised if they didn't just hand him over to the English in exchange for a tidy sum of money, then you're not far wrong. Ultimately, the king was put on trial for treason, found guilty and executed, but that wouldn't be until 1649. And in the meantime, those royalist soldiers rounded up on the battlefield by the victorious new model army were due to be marched to London. That's not where all of them ended up, however. 5,000 men is an awful lot to be marched anywhere, let alone held in one place in London, and many of this number were grievously wounded. We know that surgeons were dispatched to catch up with the entourage at Newport Pagnell, some miles south, to treat the wounded, but it's likely many of them didn't make it this far before needing medical assistance. Records show that on the 21st of June, about 3,000 of them were paraded through London and Westminster. But what of the other 2,000? Records are sketchy. It seems that many of those who made it to London were then reposted elsewhere at encampments dotted all over the countryside. Of course, much like everything in those days, where you ended up depended largely on your wealth or social standing. Officers and those with good connections or healthy bankrolls would have been deposited at country manors and placed under varying degrees of house arrest. Those of lower social standing would literally be camped in the fields. Many would have been too injured to have marched the 90 or so miles southeast to London from Naseby, and it's highly likely that field hospitals and temporary camps would have sprung up in various available locations along routes to parliamentarian outposts. And one such location is thought to have been in Ecton, just 16 miles southeast of Naseby. Back in the mid-17th century, there was a field right at the edge of the Ecton village boundary, appropriately named Town's End, and it's said that here sprung up one such prisoner encampment of wounded soldiers who were never going to manage the journey to London, and many of whom would tragically end their days in the paddock known as Town's End, or in the makeshift field hospital run out of the building opposite the encampment. The terrible loss of life is said to have permanently altered the name from Town's End to World's End, because sadly for many of these soldiers it was, and they were to end their days in the cellar of the field hospital, which was pressed into use as a mortuary. The building opposite the paddock? You guessed it, it was our pub. Could this be why landlords at the World's End have reported hearing disembodied footsteps and seeing shadowy figures in the cellar over the years? Who knows what horrors that building saw in service as a field hospital? And with such traumatic events as these, I'd be surprised if there wasn't some echo of it still lingering within the walls.
Things do get a little complicated by the historical record here, though, and many paranormal accounts of the World's End pub get rather confused, all because of a reference made by antiquarian John Cole, who writes about visiting the village in his 1825 book, The History and Antiquities of Ecton, in wonderfully florid prose.
The village is delightfully situated on rising ground, enjoys a pure atmosphere, and has its approach for about a quarter of a mile on each side of the turnpike road, flanked with venerable elm, whose umbrageous branches overshadow a grassy plain of several yards in width, which forms a delightful place of promenade. Various pleasing presentations of the lofty tower of the church offer themselves picturesquely to view through the aged trees which skirt the domain.
Now, doesn't that sound lovely? I wish people wrote as descriptively as that these days. I aspire one day to be as grandiloquent in language as a 19th century antiquarian. Anyway, I digress. The problem is that he also happened to mention in his book that the public house called the World's End had been built about 60 years since, and that the old inn it had replaced stood in a different position. This then creates a bit of a problem, particularly with the idea that the pub's cellar being haunted by restless Civil War ghosts, as this would date the pub and its cellars to around the year 1765, well after the Battle of Naseby. There is also the oddity that every single account written about the World's End that I came across stated in no uncertain terms that the pub was originally called the Globe. And although I couldn't find any actual record of this anywhere, a popular story connects this legend to famous 18th century artist William Hogarth, who was a frequent visitor to Ecton. He produced an etching titled The Bathos, featuring a ruined inn, a sign still swinging from a collapsed beam, showing a globe on fire and the name The World's End. Some suggest that Hogarth painted a similar sign for the pub in Ecton, implying that is when it changed its name from the Globe to the World's End. But I have to say this seems fairly unlikely to me, given that this engraving was one of Hogarth's last, completed only a few months before the artist's death. And it would seem that our Naseby legend may not be derailed here after all, or thanks in part to a fascinating character called John Ogleby, who, in 1698, created a curious thing called a strip map, something that I had never heard of, but is basically a linear 2D representation of the roads he surveyed, travelling from the city of Cambridge to the city of Coventry, which became one of the very first road atlases, all the way back in the 17th century. As Ogleby traversed this route, he noted down significant things about the towns and villages he passed through, and sketched where they appeared, often with a rough street plan. This was mostly large buildings such as churches, as well as landscape features like cornfields, common land or marshes. But unusually, on his way through Ecton, or Econ as it was known in 1698, he sketched and named the World's End. And in relation to the church, which he also sketched, many people agree that it doesn't look like its location moved in 1765 after all. An antiquarian, John Cole, may have been mistaken in the information he reported. From this then, it's likely we have a similar situation on our hands as we did at the Hind Hotel, not of a build in 1765, but rather a rebuild or renovation. And as for the name having originally been the Globe, I cannot for the life of me find any record of when the inn had any name other than the World's End. And at this point, we have to thank the amazing historical sleuthing of Mr. John Smith, 10 times great-grandson of the 16th century Ecton yeoman Michael Hensman, who once owned the land the inn still stands on today. Mr. Smith has written detailed notes for the World's End website, collating all the information he's been able to dig out of parish records relating to the inn. And credit where credit's due, he's done an incredible job. But piecing together what he found, it seems like the confusion around the name and the doubt that the place may have existed at the time of the Civil War is likely misplaced after all. What he found were records of a will dating back to 1620 regarding a plot of land described at the time as including a malt mill and 2 garners being left to a John Hensman. So no mention of the World's End or an inn yet, but a malt mill and 2 garners, or grain stores, is basically a recipe for a brewery, so it's already starting to sound a little bit pubby, and this is still 25 years before the Civil War. The next record that Mr. Smith has cleverly unearthed for us is a burial register for that very same John Hensman, dated 1667. And Mr. Hensman is now recorded as John Hensman Sr. of the World's End. And by 1682, the parish register records John Hensman's grandson James as innkeeper at the World's End. So what all this rather tangled history means is that sometime between 1620 and 1667, the Ecton malt mill, opposite a large field known as Town's End, became an inn, and somewhere along the way collected the name the World's End. And rather handily, the year of the Battle of Naseby, 1645, falls slap bang between those two dates. So, although the building we see above ground today is a rebuild dating from the 18th century, we have to ask ourselves how much of the original building was incorporated. And what about the foundations and those cellars? Are they the same in which royalist soldiers were tended to by surgeons? And could this explain why, in 2002, a gas technician who was working in the cellar had the fright of his life when he witnessed a man walk straight across the cellar in front of him? Shocking enough, being as he knew he was completely alone down there, but even more disturbingly, he could only see the man from the knees up. Author Dorothy Priest claims that it's clear to see in the cellar that the floor was once set at a different level, something that is quite common in buildings whose cellars date back hundreds of years. Well, whilst the Civil War connection may just explain the ghost in the cellar, it probably doesn't explain all the other hauntings at the World's End, especially not that of the Phantom Nun.
Like so many inns that we've met on our travels, the World's End, standing as it once did on a turnpike road, would have served as a coaching inn at one time in its life. And in the dangerous days of horse-drawn carriages, dicey roads and the threat of highwaymen, an inn like the World's End, brightening the roadside with its glowing lanterns and warmly lit windows, must have been a welcome sight and comfort to drivers and travellers alike. But not so for one poor 18th century driver who was passing the World's End one dark night as he traversed the road from Northampton to Wellingborough. Just as he was approaching the crossroads, he squinted into the inky black night, thinking he saw a glimpse of something. And then all of a sudden he pulled his horses up sharply, cursing and muttering and pulling on the reins with all his strength, because there, Unmoving, right in the middle of the road, was a woman dressed in nun's robes. The driver was at once furious, for he was in a desperate hurry to reach his destination, and shaken from nearly colliding with the woman. He shouted down to her, "What on earth were you thinking? I could have killed you." But the robed woman didn't respond. She didn't even move. She just stood there, silently, stonily, observing her own mysterious midnight vigil in the middle of a main road. Growing ever more frustrated, the driver hopped down from the carriage and approached the woman. Feeling more uneasy now, but really needing to get hurrying on. "Look, you're going to have to move. What's the problem? Do you need a carriage?" But the driver soon wished he hadn't got down off his coach, for as he got closer, he tried to read the woman's expression beneath her dark hood, but saw instead that there was no face there, only the empty sockets of a pale and fleshless skull. Gasping and stumbling, he scrambled back up onto his coach with heart pounding in his chest, snapping the reins and yelling to his horses to move on, desperately trying to urge them past the horrifying figure in the road and on towards his destination. But the horses would not move. Their ears flattened, eyes rolling with fear showing the whites, hooves pawing the ground. They would not pass the robed woman in the middle of the road, no matter how the driver pleaded with them. In a terror of cold sweat, he somehow managed to turn the coach around and flee back the way he had come, having to circle around way off course to finally reach Wellingborough. And now the legend is still told in the county that every Halloween at midnight, the phantom nun will appear in the middle of the dark road, stopping any traffic that tries to pass, standing silently and stonily in the middle of the dark road, her hood hiding a ghastly skeletal face. Like a terrifying phantom lollipop lady. But does she have any connection to the world's end? Well, a group of pub customers who think they encountered her in 2002 think she does. They were actually inside the pub when the figure of a woman appeared briefly in their midst, and after a few seconds simply vanished. They described the apparition as wearing a long grey dress and appearing as though they were viewing her through a murky glass. They didn't describe her as wearing a hood as far as I'm aware, but the sighting seems to have been linked now to the Phantom Nun story. Az has an encounter with a grey lady ghost witnessed on the road near the World's End in the late 1800s. A brother and sister had been walking home from a feast at a neighbouring village when they came across an ashen-faced woman trembling with fear, who blurted out that she had just seen a ghost. The pair kindly invited the poor frightened soul to walk with them and take comfort in their company, but before long they encountered another traveller on their route. Something was not quite right about the grey figure standing in the road, staring at them silently, and they realised to their horror that they could see straight through her. Moments later, she vanished. Author Dorothy Priest posits that the ghostly nun may have more to do with the old manor house of Ecton Hall than the pub. The building is just around the corner from the World's End, and John Cole, in his History and Antiquities of Ecton, records that there was thought to have once been a nunnery, or at least a cell subordinate to a local abbey, on the grounds of the manor. He writes,
"At the back of the house is a yard bounded by high walls, which still retains the name of Nuns' Court."
A nunnery so nearby could certainly explain the apparition, but we think that we might have another contender to throw into the mix. We've often talked about how we suspect many ghosts get labelled as monks, when they may not actually be, simply because a hooded figure is so reminiscent of that role, despite the fact that all sorts of people wore hooded cloaks all through history. You might think, however, that something as distinctive as a nun's wimple would be less easy to confuse. But then we came across another passage in John Cole's book, in the section about Ecton Hall.
In these gardens, about 200 yards north-eastwards from the church, as Mr. Catesby's workmen were levelling some ground in 1762, they discovered several bones and skulls lying in order from east to west. Among them were found 2 Saxon silver coins.
So, do you know who else wore wimples, headscarves, hoods and snoods to cover their hair? Christian Saxon women did, whether ecclesiastical or not. It was a common item of women's clothing according to historical artwork. We couldn't find any sources indicating when in the 18th century the unfortunate carriage driver had his brush with the skeletal woman, but bearing in mind the Saxon skeletons were unearthed in 1762, so slap bang in the middle of the 18th century, is it possible that it was disturbing these Saxon graves that caused the robed apparition to appear? Well, whether or not we have solved the mystery of the Phantom Nun, we may never know. But Dorothy Priest warns anyone wanting to conduct their own Halloween vigil to remember that it's the back of the pub that faced the old turnpike road, not the front, as she claims recent ghost hunters have apparently forgotten this and have spent their Halloween vigils on the wrong side of the pub, fruitlessly watching the traffic whiz by on the busy A4500.
Back inside the inn, we have another contender for the apparition in the cellar who was seen only from the knees up, in a rather sad story supposedly dating back to the 17th century. There is a legend at the pub that way back in its earliest days, the owner's niece was being courted by a local lad named John. But to his dismay, his affections were not returned by the girl. In a classic tragedy of unrequited love and hot-headed revenge, the inn owner's niece spurned the lad's affections in favour of a more exotic visitor from overseas. And when John found out that the woman he was in love with was not only uninterested, but also set to bear another man's child, he lost control of reason, and confronting the pair in the cellar of the World's End, murdered the poor woman and the man she was in love with. The next part of the story doesn't speak very well of the inn's owner at that time either, for it's said that he covered up the crime and disposed of the bodies, although the tale doesn't mention how or where. It's said that the unhappy spirits of the tragic couple both wander the inn still, and some wonder whether they're responsible for at least some of the other ghostly activity that goes on there. Staff have reported seeing shadowy figures and hearing phantom footsteps crossing the bar and dining areas and walking up the stairs. At other times, items have been reported to fall off shelves, seemingly of their own accord. A manageress once felt someone brush past her on the stairs, and curiously, at the same time, she heard a crackling, buzzing sound and received something that felt a bit like an electric shock. She's not the only one who has felt the touch of a phantom hand in the pub either, for a more recent guest reported that she had felt the gentle push of an unseen hand on her arm whilst she was sitting in the restaurant. The customer had been seated up against a wall, so it wasn't possible for there to be anyone behind her, and there was no one else in the vicinity at the time. There may be many more spirits than just the star-crossed lovers roaming these walls, though, particularly in the first and second floor flats. Here, people have reported seeing the ghost of a young girl wearing Victorian-era clothing. She seems to be a little bit of a mischievous spirit, as apparently toiletries are regularly found having inexplicably been moved from the bathroom to the kitchen. Cold spots are felt. Electrical equipment placed in one particular corner mysteriously failed to function. And on one occasion, teaspoons were found stacked up in the kitchen in a most peculiar way. In addition to the little girl spirit, there has also been an older-looking apparition haunting the flats, as one person found out when they were staying at the inn to visit with a friend. They reportedly handed some dirty dishes to an older lady, thinking that it was his friend's mother, thinking nothing of the encounter at the time. It was only later, when they mentioned it to their friend, that they were informed that whoever they had handed the plates to, it was definitely not the friend's mother. And, in fact, there was no one fitting their description staying in the building at all. But maybe the most baffling sighting comes from a young man in the early 1990s who was installing a CCTV camera behind the bar. He wasn't working alone, he had colleagues working in the bar with him. But that only made it all the more surprising when he noticed an indistinct figure in the bar amongst them. It was no one he recognised, certainly not one of the work team. And what was stranger still was that no one else seemed to have noticed the odd-looking person. Already frozen to the spot in apprehension, we can only imagine his shock when he witnessed one of his crew walk right through the figure in front of him. It's small wonder, really, that such a collection of ghosts and hauntings would reside within these walls that have stood through hundreds of years of turbulent history, or that some sad and even sinister tales would have become associated with the inn over the centuries. But we certainly don't experience any dark or oppressive feelings here, and rather sadly for us, neither do we encounter the phantom nun. Sitting on the deck in the warm sunshine, full of good food and coffee, it's easy to imagine the hustle and bustle of the 16th and 17th century streets that the inn overlooked during the time that Benjamin Franklin's family worked a forge here. But we seem very far removed from the devastation of the Civil War that gave this inn the foreboding name of the World's End. And maybe that's for the best. Although we didn't encounter any apparitions ourselves along our journey this time, what better way to explore our local history than to follow in the footsteps of those involved in one of the most famous moments in the history of the whole country, visit the places they stopped along the way, and learn all about their stories, characters and hauntings, all whilst indulging in a rather splendid pub garden lunch. Thankfully, there are a great many haunted pubs for us to explore in England, with some amazing stories from history to tell, so I'm sure that this won't be our last haunted pub crawl.
And I'm afraid that leaving the World's End leaves us at the end of this episode. Thank you all so much for joining us, and a very special thank you to our patrons, without whose support we wouldn't be able to produce the show. And if you'd like to help support the show, then please do check out our Patreon, where you can make a donation from as little as $1 a month. We are also always in need of your true spooky experiences, so if you've had a paranormal encounter, please do get in touch through our website at knockOncevs.com, as we're actually running a bit low on stories. If you are also a podcaster, then do remember that I also do editing and post-production work, so do get in touch either through knockOncevs or my business narrativeaudio.com if you'd like to outsource your podcast editing. And that, as they say, is that for this episode. And we hope you'll join us next time for another Knock Once for Yes.
EVP session end.